It was a sunny spring morning in the Italian Alps when 55-year-old Laura Ziliani set out for a routine hike and vanished without a trace. Temu, a small mountain village in Lombardy with just over 1,000 residents, awoke to the alarming news that one of their own was missing. Laura was well known in the community, a former local policewoman and an experienced hiker who knew the alpine trails by heart. May 8, 2021, the eve of Mother's Day, was supposed to be a peaceful weekend in the mountains for Laura. Instead, it became the starting point of a disturbing mystery. That Saturday, Laura had travelled from the city of Brescia, where she worked for the municipal government, back to her hometown of Temu for the weekend. Widowed since 2012, her husband had tragically died in a mountain avalanche. Laura had built a new life centred on her 3 daughters and her work, and she often returned to Temu on weekends to check on the family's properties and enjoy the outdoors. She was fit, cautious, and familiar with the terrain, which made what happened next all the more baffling. That evening of May 7th, Laura was at the family's holiday home in Temu with 2 of her daughters, 27-year-old Silvia Zani and 19-year-old Paola Zani, as well as Silvia's boyfriend, 27-year-old Mirto Milani. The family gathering was in part to celebrate Mother's Day together. By all accounts, the night was uneventful. The daughters even baked treats, muffins, as a surprise for their mum. Nothing seemed amiss as the family headed to bed. The next morning, however, took a dire turn. According to Silvia and Paola, Laura rose early around dawn on May 8th and decided to go for one of her customary solo hikes in the wooded mountains above the village. It wasn't unusual for Laura to trek those paths. She was an expert mountaineer and loved the trails near Temu's hamlet of Villa d'Alegno. She allegedly told her daughters she'd be back by late morning for an appointment they had planned together. When noon came and went with no sign of Laura, her daughters grew concerned and tried calling her cell phone. No answer. By 11:58 a.m., Silvia placed a call to the Carabinieri, the Italian military police, to report her mother missing. In a trembling voice, she told the police dispatcher that her mother had left around 7 a.m. for a hike and never returned. "Mom hasn't come back from her hike," she said, explaining that Laura knew the area well but had simply vanished. Immediately, a search operation was launched in the rugged alpine terrain around Temu. Within hours, dozens of volunteers from the Alpine Rescue Corps, firefighters, and civil protection units fanned out over the forested slopes and deep valleys. They scoured 2,500 kilometers of trails and terrain, using GPS trackers, search dogs, and even drones. The Oglio River, which runs through the village, was dredged in case Laura had fallen in or been swept downstream. The entire community rallied, anxious to find any trace of the missing woman. Given Laura's background and fitness, people hoped she might have simply had an accident or gotten temporarily lost, perhaps injured on a remote path waiting for help. As days passed with no sign of Laura, the situation grew more dire. The wilderness search continued intensively for a week, but yielded nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing. It was as if the mountain had swallowed her whole. Concern turned to dread. Friends and neighbours organised continuous search parties, and even those who didn't know Laura personally felt the gravity of the situation. In a close-knit Italian village, a missing person is everyone's concern. Yet after a full week of fruitless searching, authorities had to scale back the massive effort. Hope was fading. Desperate for answers, Laura's family turned to the media. Just days after the disappearance, her 2 eldest daughters, Silvia and Paola, made a tearful public appeal on national television. They appeared on Ci l'ha visto, a popular Italian TV program that helps locate missing persons. Cameras captured the sisters with reddened eyes and halting voices. "Please, if anyone has seen our mother, help us," they implored, sobbing as they described how Laura was a beloved mother and grandmother. Laura also had a middle daughter, 24-year-old Lucia, who has disabilities and depended on her care. The girl's emotional plea asked anyone who knew something to come forward. Their distress was palpable. 2 daughters beside themselves with worry, begging for their mother's safe return. The country sympathized with Sylvia and Paola. They were young women facing every child's worst nightmare, a parent gone missing in perilous circumstances. The press dutifully reported on Laura's character, a devoted mother of 3, known for her dedication to her community and her resilience after her husband's death. Yet amid the outpouring of concern, investigators on the case were starting to notice that something about this disappearance didn't add up. In missing persons cases, the simplest explanation is often an accident or misadventure, especially in a wilderness setting. Initially, many assumed Laura must have slipped on a trail or become incapacitated far from the path. But as the search dragged on, the lack of any evidence of a fall or animal attack made investigators increasingly uneasy. Laura's extensive hiking experience meant she usually carried a phone, knew the routes, and would leave word if she changed plans. The complete absence of physical evidence, no broken branches, no discarded gear, was unusual. Seasoned Carabinieri officers quietly began considering other possibilities, even ones they hadn't voiced publicly. On May 23, 2021, 2 full weeks after Laura went missing, a breakthrough occurred. A resident of Tamu was scanning the landscape with binoculars from his window, looking out over the greenery near a small stream called the Fiumeclo, when he noticed something strange. In a thicket by the water, a young man and woman were moving around, poking through the brush as if searching for something. The pair then left the area, and the local witness grew curious. He decided to venture out to the spot where he'd seen them. There, hidden among the undergrowth, he discovered a single hiking shoe, a Salomon brand trekking shoe, coloured violet with orange stripes. It matched the description of the footwear Laura was wearing when she disappeared. This discovery electrified the investigation. 2 days earlier, on May 21st, another shoe, the mate to this one, had been found upstream in the creek bed by a volunteer searcher. At the time, the lone shoe's presence had been inconclusive. It was presumed to be Laura's, but without more evidence it could have simply been lost if she'd been swept away by water. Now finding the second shoe, and especially finding it in these circumstances, raised red flags. The fact that a man and woman were seen lurking and seemingly planting the shoe in the bushes suggested a deliberate staging. Investigators now suspected that these shoes didn't end up there by accident at all, but were placed to mislead the search effort. The Carabinieri collected the shoe as evidence and quietly followed up on the eyewitness account. Who were that young man and woman spotted in the woods on May 25th? In a village of 1,100 people, strangers would stand out. If they were locals, it narrowed the possibilities. The authorities kept this information under wraps, but it reinforced a developing theory within the investigative team. What if Laura Ziliani had not gone missing by accident? What if someone close to her was hiding the truth? Days later, on June 10th, another curious find deepened the mystery. Some passers-by noticed a pair of jeans lying in the bed of the Fiumeclo stream, snagged on some rocks. The pants were retrieved and identified as roughly Laura's size. Yet when asked about this clothing, Mirto Milani, Sylvia's boyfriend and one of the last people to see Laura alive, told investigators that he had never seen Laura wear those jeans. This was odd. If the pants truly belonged to Laura, one would expect her family, and Mirto, who was practically family, to recognize them. If they didn't belong to her, why were they turning up in the area of the search, presented as if they were evidence? It was as though someone was deliberately casting false clues around the landscape. First a shoe, then another, then a pair of pants, a breadcrumb trail that led nowhere useful. By early summer, the case of Laura's disappearance had shifted from a search and rescue operation to a full-fledged criminal inquiry. Carabinieri detectives and the Brescia Public Prosecutor's Office started taking a hard look at those closest to Laura. As painful as it was to consider, statistics show that when foul play is involved in a missing adult case, family members are often involved. investigators began re-interviewing Laura's daughters and Mirto, examining their statements for inconsistencies and verifying their alibis. They also dug into Laura's personal affairs for any hint of conflict or motive. What they found would quietly set the stage for a stunning revelation. One of the first things that struck the investigative team was the unusual behavior of Sylvia and Paola on the very weekend their mother disappeared. Normally, according to friends and relatives, the Zani sisters were late risers, typical young adults who might sleep in on a free morning. Yet on May 8th, the day Laura supposedly went hiking and vanished, both daughters had awoken at the crack of dawn. They claimed this was to see their mother off on her trek, but it was out of character for them to be up so early. That small anomaly became one piece of a growing puzzle. Another piece came from Laura's mobile phone data. Investigators managed to recover Laura's phone from the family home's basement, where it had strangely been stashed behind some hiking equipment in a storage area. Data on the phone showed that on the morning of May 8th, the device had only registered 38 steps, likely just a few steps around the house, before it went still. If Laura had truly set out on a mountain hike, her phone's health app should have logged thousands of steps. Instead, it appeared that someone might have quickly walked the phone a short distance, perhaps to hide it in the cellar, and then turned it off or left it in place. This was a critical clue. It indicated that Laura never embarked on that excursion in the woods at all. The official missing persons narrative, that she left home early and never returned, was starting to crumble. Moreover, cell tower records placed Sylvia, Paola, and Mirto in very telling locations in the weeks following the disappearance. Their mobile phones pinged in exactly the areas and at exactly the times that the suspicious clues were later discovered. For instance, the trio's phones were tracked near the Fiumeclo Creek around May 23rd to 25th, aligning with when and where the Salomon hiking shoes were found. Again, on June 10th, phone data suggested at least one of them was in proximity to the spot where the jeans were discovered shortly thereafter. These coincidences were too strong to ignore. It was as if the supposed search party members were always conveniently nearby right before new evidence turned up. Investigators also learned that none of Laura's personal effects were truly missing, except those few items that later reappeared as planted clues. Her backpack, wallet, and keys were all accounted for at home. Even Laura's hiking boots were at the house. The shoes left by the creek were an older pair she no longer used regularly. The more detectives looked, the more it seemed that the narrative of Laura marching off into the mountains was a fiction. Behind the scenes, police started surveilling and wiretapping the primary people of interest, Sylvia, Paola, and Mirto. If they had staged a disappearance, perhaps they would slip up and discuss it among themselves. Italy's justice system permits extensive use of phone intercepts in serious cases, and soon transcripts of the trio's conversations began to yield telling information. The first hints of a motive emerged when police analysts reviewed calls and messages between the Zani sisters and Mirto in late May 2021. Shockingly, less than 3 weeks after Laura's disappearance, instead of expressing fear or grief, the trio were overheard excitedly discussing financial matters. In a call on May 26th, Mirto and the sisters talked about raising the rents on properties that had belonged to Laura, collecting overdue payments from tenants, and even rerouting rent deposits into the sisters' bank account. They seemed impatient to assume control of Laura's sizable estate of real estate holdings. That same morning, one sister can be heard congratulating the other for the money we'll soon be getting. This conversation was chilling, as if Laura were already gone for good, and they were eager to reap the benefits. These intercepts pointed toward a clear economic motive. Laura, as investigators discovered, was quite well off. She and her daughters jointly owned multiple properties, houses, apartments, and parcels of land in Temu and possibly elsewhere, which generated significant rental income. With Laura alive, that income went to maintaining the family and would eventually be split among the heirs. But with Laura dead, her share would presumably pass to her daughters, effectively giving them full control. The Zani sisters, according to relatives, had always been very attached to money, perhaps even excessively so. Mirto, though not a family member by blood, appeared equally fixated on Laura's assets. In fact, Laura's own elderly mother later testified that Laura had once confided in her about a disturbing incident. Mirto had confronted Laura, accusing her of spending too much on renovating one of her properties, and his tone was inappropriately domineering. Laura was taken aback that her daughter's boyfriend would involve himself so aggressively in her financial decisions. This conflict now loomed large in hindsight. By early summer, investigating magistrate Alessandra Sabatucci was compiling these findings into a case file. In Italy, a judge for preliminary investigations reviews evidence and can issue arrest warrants for suspects, detailing the rationale in a written order. Judge Sabatucci's emerging report painted a dark picture of a plot premeditated well in advance, driven by greed, and carried out by those closest to Laura. The staged disappearance was intended, as she wrote, to conceal the death of the woman for a long time, and to throw investigations off track. In other words, whoever was responsible had tried to create the illusion that Laura either had an accident or perhaps even intentionally disappeared to divert suspicion from themselves. One particularly incriminating piece of evidence was an internet search history linked to Mirto Milani. A friend of Paola's told police that Paola confided in her about Mirto's bizarre online searches in the months before Laura's death. He had allegedly researched topics like how to kill people, poisonous plants, and perfect crimes. This revelation, when combined with everything else, made the trio of Mirto and the two sisters look less like anxious family members and more like criminal conspirators. Investigators realized they might be dealing with something almost unthinkable: two daughters and a boyfriend conspiring to murder a mother. Throughout June and July 2021, the Carabinieri kept Silvia, Paola, and Mirto under close watch, while forensic analyses were underway. Finally, on August 8, 2021, a crucial development brought both relief and horror. Laura's body was found. On that August afternoon, a family out for a casual nature walk made a grim discovery along the banks of the Oglio River, not far from the village. It was a child who first spotted it, the partially hidden figure of a human body, lying face down in the brush behind a tangle of bushes on the riverbank. The body had no clothing except for underwear, no pants, no shirt, no shoes, and was badly decomposed after roughly 3 months exposed to the elements. It was found along a popular cycling path in the upper Val Camonica Valley, directly across from a hydroelectric plant's reservoir. Given the state of decay, it appeared the remains had been there for quite some time, yet somehow had been overlooked in earlier searches. The location was eerily close to town and near where search teams had passed in May. Authorities were called immediately, and the area was cordoned off. Although the body was unrecognizable, clues strongly suggested it was Laura. For one, a small cyst on the right foot matched a unique physical detail Laura was known to have. Additionally, the corpse still had earrings in the earlobes, and family members identified them as the earrings Laura often wore. A DNA test was ordered for confirmation, and on August 17th the results came back, erasing any doubt. The remains were indeed those of Laura Ziliani. The discovery of Laura's body transformed the case into a homicide investigation. The Brescia prosecutor, Mario Bendoni, now had a corpus delicti, concrete evidence of a death, and possibly a crime scene. But what exactly was the crime? The condition of the body yielded some information, but also deepened the mystery. The medical examiners found no obvious wounds. There were no bullet holes or stab injuries, no broken bones or internal trauma, and notably no water in the lungs. The absence of water definitively ruled out drowning as the cause of death. Laura had not fallen into the river alive. There were also no telltale marks around the neck, such as hyoid bone fractures or ligature impressions that would conclusively indicate strangulation. In fact, externally, Laura's body bore no clear signs of violence at all. Initially, this might seem perplexing. How could a healthy adult die suddenly with no injuries? But to investigators, it aligned with their growing theory. If Laura had been poisoned or suffocated, there might be little external evidence. Toxicology tests were conducted on what tissue and fluids remained. Given the state of decomposition, it was challenging, but lab results later supported the hypothesis that Laura had been drugged with benzodiazepines, potent tranquilizers, before death. And while there were no external strangulation marks, suffocation by smothering, for example with a pillow or plastic bag, can leave minimal traces, especially after the soft tissues degrade post-mortem. The forensic pathologist's preliminary conclusion, later confirmed by full autopsy, was that Laura had likely been sedated and then asphyxiated. In other words, she was incapacitated by drugs and then smothered while unconscious or too weak to resist. With Laura's body found, investigators moved swiftly. They now had enough evidence to make arrests, and they feared that if they waited any longer, the suspects might flee or interfere with evidence. In the pre-dawn hours of September 24, 2021, Carabinieri units descended simultaneously on multiple locations, executing warrants. That morning, the Italian public woke up to shocking news. Silvia Zani, Paola Zani, and Mirto Milani, Laura's own 2 daughters and her daughter's boyfriend, had been arrested on suspicion of murdering Laura Ziliani. The arrests sent shockwaves through the Alpine community of Tamu and across Italy. Neighbours and friends could not comprehend that the same young women who had cried on TV for their mother's return were now perp-walked out of their home in handcuffs, accused of killing her. The case instantly transformed from a local tragedy into a national scandal, as people struggled to understand how such a diabolical trio could form within a family. Silvia and Paola were taken into custody at their Brescia apartment, where they lived together, without incident. They reportedly clutched each other's hands as police led them away, remaining stoic. Mirto Milani was arrested separately. Like the sisters, he did not resist. Mirto was a particularly interesting figure to both investigators and the press. Outwardly, he was the picture of an upstanding young man, a trained psychologist and an accomplished countertenor singer who performed in church choirs. He came from the town of Calolzio Corte, in nearby Lecco province, but had integrated himself into the Zani family over the prior few years through his relationship with Silvia. It later emerged that Mirto wasn't just Silvia's boyfriend, he was also intimately involved with Paola, the younger sister. This salacious detail, confirmed by the suspect's own statements, painted the trio's relationship as a tangled web of love and manipulation. Mirto had effectively become the lover of both sisters, fostering a strange insular alliance among the 3 of them. It was a detail that would fascinate and horrify the public in equal measure, and it hinted at the psychological hold he may have had over the sisters. Upon arrest, Silvia, Paola, and Mirto were each charged with voluntary homicide, murder, and concealment of a corpse. Italian law treats premeditated murder with severe gravity. The maximum penalty is life imprisonment, and additional charges like hiding a body can add years. The trio was placed in pre-trial detention at Canton Mombello prison in Brescia as the investigation continued. Under Italy's system, the prosecution had time to firm up the case while the suspects remained jailed, since there is no immediate bail for such serious accusations. All 3 suspects initially maintained their silence on the advice of their lawyers. They did not confess, nor did they make public statements declaring innocence. Essentially, they hunkered down, forcing prosecutors to prove the case. However, much of the evidence gathered in the judge's 38-page arrest warrant was damning. Judge Sabatucci's document, now made public, outlined the suspicious phone data, the planted evidence, the financial motive, and the inconsistencies in the suspects' accounts. It specifically highlighted how tightly knit and secretive the small village was, insinuating that without the community's vigilance, like that neighbour with binoculars, the trio might have gotten away with it. The warrant also detailed how each of the 3 appeared to have a role in the plot, and it described Mirto as the architect who orchestrated the murder plan. Indeed, investigators believed that Mirto was a driving force behind the crime. As a psychology graduate, he might have considered himself intellectually savvy enough to plan a perfect crime. He had attempted to fabricate a scenario of Laura disappearing due to imaginary debts, even telling a friend over the phone that perhaps Laura had run away to live it up somewhere. Maybe she diverted money to another account. This was clearly a lie, as Laura had no such debts. It was part of Mirto's strategy, lay false trails to mislead both the police and other relatives. That phone call had been intercepted by police and included in the dossier, showing Mirto's manipulative mindset. The public soon learned even more disturbing allegations. Reports emerged that the sisters had wiped their cell phones of data prior to handing them over to police in June. Initially, when investigators asked to see their phones, the trio oddly claimed they didn't have them, saying Mirto had sold all their old phones to a Moroccan at the train station and that they'd bought new devices. This was a bizarre and suspicious story on its face. A month later, they did turn in their old phones, but the memory on each had been completely erased. Confronted about this, each suspect offered an embarrassing personal excuse. Sylvia said she erased data because she had joined a wife-swapping group online and was ashamed for anyone to find out. Paula, on the other hand, admitted she didn't want anyone to see evidence that I have a relationship with my sister's fiancé, effectively confirming her illicit affair with Mirto. These excuses, absurd as they sounded, inadvertently corroborated the love triangle and suggested the trio had plenty of secrets, lending further credence to the prosecution's view that they were hiding far more than just salacious texts. Meanwhile, the human toll on the rest of the Ziliani family was immense. The third daughter, Lucia Zani, who was 24 and cognitively disabled, had lived with her mother and depended on her daily. With Laura gone and her two sisters now jailed accused of matricide, Lucia was left under the care of relatives. In an interview with Corriere della Sera, Lucia expressed heartbreak and anger, saying, "We were practically inseparable. I'm glad they have been arrested. They will never have my forgiveness." It was a poignant reminder that this crime had utterly shattered a family. Lucia lost her mother, and in effect her sisters in one blow. Laura's own mother, the girl's grandmother Marisa, was devastated. She had initially refused to believe her granddaughters could be involved, but over time even she had noted their obsession with money and felt something was off. Those three were too attached to money, Marisa told investigators, referring to Sylvia, Paula, and Mirto. And she recalled Laura's complaints about Mirto meddling in financial matters that didn't concern him. Marissa's statements helped authorities piece together a narrative of family tension and greed building up to the crime. By the autumn of 2021, prosecutors felt they had a strong circumstantial case, even if they still lacked a direct confession or an eyewitness to the murder itself. Italy's legal system allows defendants to be held for trial when a serious circumstantial evidence standard is met. Here, that threshold was clearly satisfied. Multiple converging clues all pointed at the same trio. The investigation phase was officially closed in the spring of 2022, and the stage was set for a trial in the Corte d'Assise, Italian Court for Serious Crimes, of Brescia. However, before the trial even began, the case took another dramatic turn. One of the accused decided to talk. In a shocking development in May 2022, 8 months after their arrest, Mirto Milani broke his silence. Perhaps feeling the walls closing in or burdened by guilt, Mirto requested a meeting with the prosecutors and investigators. He indicated he was ready to confess. When Mirto finally spoke, the story that spilled out was almost too horrific to believe. According to official accounts, Mirto provided a full, detailed confession during an interrogation at Canton Mombello prison in Brescia. He admitted outright that he, along with Sylvia and Paola Zani, had murdered Laura Ziliani. As he described the events of that night in early May 2021, the true nature of Laura's fate became clear, and it was more brutal and cold-blooded than anyone had imagined. Mirto revealed that the plan to kill Laura had been set in motion months earlier. In the summer of 2020, as he told it, the sisters and he began discussing the idea that Laura was an obstacle in their lives and that the only way to solve the problem was to eliminate her. This timeline corroborated what investigators already suspected from phone and computer records, that the trio had been plotting well in advance. They chose the weekend of May 7th to 8th, 2021 deliberately. It was Mother's Day weekend, which meant Laura would definitely come to Tamu to be with her daughters, and they could use the celebration as a pretext to all gather. It would also allow a cover story that Laura went hiking on her own. Mirto's confession, which was later corroborated by both sisters, outlined the murder method in grim detail. On the night of May 7th, 2021, the group put their plan into action. Sylvia and Paula baked a batch of muffins, ostensibly as a treat for their mother. But unbeknownst to Laura, one of the muffins was laced with a heavy dose of benzodiazepine, a sedative tranquilizer. When the muffins were served, they ensured Laura ate the drugged one. Their hope was that the medication would render her unconscious within about 10 minutes. However, things did not go exactly as planned. Laura had a strong constitution, and after eating the dessert, she did not immediately collapse or fall asleep. Instead, she felt only drowsy and eventually decided to go to bed, unaware of what had been done to her. Sometime later that night, presumably in the early hours of May 8th, Laura awoke feeling unwell. Likely disoriented by the drug, she got up to get a drink from the refrigerator in the kitchen. It was at this moment that the trio seized their chance to strike. As Laura was in the kitchen, Sylvia suddenly attacked her mother from behind, fueled by what Myrto called a sudden fury. Sylvia grabbed Laura and began to choke or subdue her. Laura, startled and now fighting for her life, struggled and even managed to grapple with her daughter. At one point, the strong 55-year-old mother fell on top of Sylvia during the struggle. Paula then jumped in, literally leaping onto her mother to pin her down. Despite being drugged and outnumbered, Laura did not die easily. She resisted fiercely. Her survival instinct was strong. The two daughters could not fully subdue the woman who had raised them. Seeing that Laura was still breathing and presumably fighting, Myrto took the next planned step. He and the sisters had prepared for this contingency. They had a plastic garbage bag and adhesive tape at the ready. Myrto and one of the sisters, it's unclear which, likely Sylvia, forced the plastic bag over Laura's head and sealed it tightly around her neck with tape and an electrical extension cord. Essentially, they suffocated her by cutting off her air supply. Laura's body convulsed for a long time, Myrto recounted, suggesting a protracted, agonizing death throe. It's possible that the benzodiazepines somewhat dulled Laura's consciousness, a small mercy amidst the horror, but one haunting uncertainty remained. Myrto admitted to his interrogators that he wasn't entirely sure if Laura was fully dead when they subsequently buried her. With Laura finally still and presumably lifeless, the trio now faced the task of disposing of her body. Under the cover of darkness, they carried Laura's body out of the house. They had already planned where to hide it. In fact, according to investigative records, they had even pre-dug a grave in a secluded spot beforehand. However, for reasons unknown, they ended up not using that initial burial pit. Perhaps they feared it was too close to home or might be discovered. Instead, they transported Laura's body to the riverbank area where she would later be found. It is believed they used Laura's own car, or another vehicle arranged by Myrto, to move her body in the dead of night, parking near the cycling path and carrying her a short distance into the brush. There, they left her on the ground among the vegetation, partially concealed, not a proper burial, but hidden from casual view. They likely chose that spot thinking the body might eventually be washed into the river or further concealed by nature. In a morbid calculation, they might have counted on wildlife or the elements to accelerate decomposition and make cause of death harder to determine. In fact, decomposition did erase many forensic traces. The body lay undiscovered for 3 months through spring rains and early summer heat. It was only luck that a passerby noticed something in August. The conspirators in the meantime acted as if Laura was simply missing, all while knowing exactly where she lay. Myrto's confession didn't end with the act itself. He also detailed the cover-up efforts that followed. In the days after May 8th, Sylvia and Paula, under Myrto's direction, set about planting the false clues. They dropped Laura's hiking shoes in the stream bed and woods to mislead the searchers. They disposed of some of Laura's clothing, like an old pair of jeans, in places it might be found, to create the impression she had been caught in a flood, or tried to shed weight while lost. Myrto coached the sisters on what to say to police and how to behave during public appeals. He even concocted the story about Laura having secret debts and fleeing, a story he told not directly to police, but to friends, knowing it might get back to investigators and send them on a wild goose chase. One truly astounding aspect of Myrto's confession is what prompted him to finally come clean. It turns out that his moral resolve was not entirely self-started. A fellow inmate at the Brescia prison, Mirto's cellmate, had befriended him in the preceding months. Mirto had gradually confided the details of the crime to this cellmate, essentially unburdening himself and perhaps even bragging about the perfect crime they tried to pull off. The cellmate, horrified by what he heard, decided to act for an ethical question, as he later said. He reported Mirto's admissions to the authorities and agreed to wear a wire, hidden recording device to capture Mirto recounting the story again. This sting operation yielded clear taped evidence of Mirto describing the murder in his own words: the muffin, the strangling, the plastic bag. Confronted with these recorded conversations and likely realizing the game was up, Mirto requested to officially confess. In essence, the cellmate's brave cooperation was the final catalyst that forced Mirto's hand and blew open the case, providing prosecutors with a first-person narrative of the crime. Following Mirto's confession in May 2022, both Silvia and Paola also decided to cooperate, perhaps realizing there was no point maintaining the charade. Within hours, Silvia Zani was brought in for interrogation, and she too confessed her role in the murder. Paola soon did the same, confirming the account laid out by Mirto. After finally admitting the truth to authorities, Mirto reportedly had a breakdown, an emotional collapse that required him to be briefly hospitalized, as the weight of his actions seemed to crash down upon him. The confessions allowed investigators to finally reconstruct the events with clarity. The forensic evidence, drug traces, lack of external injuries, timeline inconsistencies, all aligned with the story of poisoning and smothering. In fact, the autopsy had strongly pointed to this all along. Lab tests had found traces of benzodiazepines in Laura's system and no evidence of any other fatal trauma. Now they had direct admissions to corroborate it. However, one aspect still puzzled both investigators and the public: the motive. While it was evident that money and inheritance were factors, given the intercepted conversations about rents and the grandmother's statements, the accused started putting forward a different startling justification during their confessions. According to Silvia and Paola, especially Silvia, the murder was not primarily about financial gain or hatred, but rather something bizarre. They claimed they killed their mother out of fear that Laura was going to kill them. During her confession, and later during trial, Silvia Zani spun a narrative that portrayed herself and her siblings as potential victims, asserting that their mother, Laura, had become dangerous. She told the investigators how she believed her mother was poisoning her by adding bleach to her milk. Prosecutors and Laura's extended family flatly rejected Silvia's claims. There was no evidence whatsoever that Laura ever intended harm to her children. In fact, by all accounts, Laura was a loving, if perhaps sometimes strict mother who supported her daughters even into adulthood. The idea that she plotted to kill them was seen as a desperate and baseless attempt by the defendants to mitigate their own guilt. Investigators believed that the sisters and Mirto had perhaps built a false narrative among themselves, almost like a shared fantasy, to justify their heinous plan. It's possible that telling themselves, "We have to do this to survive," made it psychologically easier for them to commit the crime. But it had no grounding in reality. The true motive, as the prosecution would argue, was a toxic mix of greed, resentment, and a warped sense of unity among the trio. They wanted control of Laura's money and assets, and perhaps, in some twisted way, they also wanted to prove their devotion to each other by committing the ultimate crime together. It was less a crime of passion or impulse than a crime of calculation and ego. Indeed, when the case eventually went to trial, the judges came to a striking conclusion. Laura Ziliani was killed not for money, not for hatred, but to gratify the killer's own egos and to celebrate the cohesion of their little group. In other words, beyond any practical benefits like inheritance, the murder served as a kind of perverse bonding experience for Mirto, Silvia, and Paola, a secret that tied them together and set them apart from everyone else. This conclusion was drawn from the meticulous planning and the almost theatrical staging of clues, which suggested the trio derived a sense of pride in committing a clever crime. It later emerged that the group had been heavily influenced by crime television shows. Silvia testified that in plotting the murder, they took inspiration from series like Dexter, a show about a forensic expert who lives a double life as a vigilante killer. The trio discussed various methods to kill without getting caught. At one point, they considered using poisonous plants, and at another juncture, they debated slipping antifreeze, ethylene glycol, into a herbal tea as a means to quietly poison Laura. These attempts either never materialized or didn't work. Ultimately, they settled on the plan that was executed: sedatives and suffocation, which they wrongly assumed would leave no trace. Myrto's background in psychology also played a role. There was speculation that he exhibited narcissistic traits and manipulated the sisters by exploiting their grievances and insecurities. An Italian TV special on the case even dubbed him Narcissus, delving into how a charismatic manipulator could convince two young women to turn on their own mother. However, the legal outcome did not frame it as the sisters being brainwashed innocents. Rather, all three were seen as equally culpable co-conspirators. As one report later put it, there was no imbalance of roles among the three defendants. Each willingly participated and shared responsibility. The court found that each of them had contributed to both the planning and execution of the crime in their own way. With confessions in hand and a trove of evidence, the case proceeded to trial in 2023 in the Brescia Court d'Assise. In the Italian justice system, serious crimes like murder are tried not by a lone judge or a jury of 12, as in some Anglo-American systems, but by a panel of judges and lay jurors. Specifically, for a case like this, there would typically be 2 professional judges and 6 civilian jurors sitting together to hear the case and decide the verdict. These lay jurors are ordinary citizens, but unlike a US jury, they deliberate alongside the judges and all have equal votes in the verdict. Italian trials are also generally inquisitorial in nature. Much of the evidence is presented in written form, and the judges have often reviewed the case file, the dossier, prior to the trial. This can be quite different from what a common law observer might expect. The judges in Italy play a more active fact-finding role, and there is no process of selecting a completely uninformed jury of peers. In fact, the judges knew all about the confessions and evidence long before the public trial sessions began. The trial of Silvia Zani, Paola Zani, and Myrto Milani was highly anticipated and drew significant media attention. Italian media dubbed them the criminal trio or diabolic trio, emphasizing the almost folkloric evil of 2 sisters and a lover plotting a mother's death. The courtroom was packed with journalists and family members. On the bench, as a civil party, was an attorney representing Laura's disabled daughter Lucia. As the victim's family, she had the right to seek damages and have a voice in the proceedings. Lucia herself did not attend, but her presence was felt through the proceedings, a reminder of the innocent life most shattered by this crime. During the trial, the prosecution methodically laid out the chain of evidence with almost clinical precision. They had the timeline of cell phone pings, the forensic drug analysis, the records of bank accounts and prospective financial moves, the surveillance footage. Some CCTV in the village showed the suspect's movements on key days, and of course the crown jewels, the confessions. Typically, a confession might make a trial almost a formality, but here the defense didn't completely concede guilt. Instead, the defense lawyers attempted to color the circumstances, essentially trying to reduce moral blame, if not deny the act. One defense angle was to claim that the defendants were mentally not fully sound or were under some kind of diminished capacity. They hinted at psychological issues, pointing to the unusual group dynamic and even raising the specter of possible insanity. In fact, after conviction, one defense lawyer was quoted as saying, "We had hoped for a new psychiatric evaluation," suggesting they wanted the appeals court to consider the sisters, or Myrto, as not entirely sane. However, this approach did not gain traction. The court found no grounds for an insanity defense. The crime was too well organized, too rational in its meticulous planning, to be written off as the product of a diseased mind. The courtroom testimony provided some of the most dramatic moments of the trial. The prosecution called numerous witnesses, forensic experts, the Carabinieri investigators, neighbors like the man with the binoculars, and relatives like Grandma Marissa. Each added pieces to the story. The scientists confirmed the sedative in Laura's system. The tech experts explained the phone data and internet searches. The neighbor recounted watching the shoe being planted, and Marissa spoke tearfully of how her granddaughters loved money and how Laura had worried about Mirto's influence. Then came the testimony of the accused themselves. In Italy, defendants have the right to make statements, and while they can choose not to testify under oath, since there is no jury per se, Silvia and Paola did speak at various points, giving their version of events and emotional state. Mirto Milani, having confessed, mostly let his earlier statement stand. He did not take the stand to dramatically profess innocence or anything of that sort. Observers noted he appeared subdued, head often bowed, as the gruesome details of his own plan were read into the record from his confession. Silvia Zani took a different tack. On the stand, or in her unsworn statements, Silvia was defiant and tried to justify the murder with the narrative of being threatened by her mother. She recounted the alleged bleach in milk story. "When I killed her, I was 300% sure she wanted to kill us," she testified emphatically. However, she added, "Now, after months in prison, I'm not so sure." This admission that her certainty had waned did her no favours. It suggested that even she recognised the falsehood of the tale she'd told herself. Silvia also admitted that they got inspiration from TV shows like Dexter in plotting the murder. She detailed how they considered poison and antifreeze before settling on suffocation. Her testimony laid bare a cold-blooded premeditation. Far from helping her case, it solidified the view that this was first-degree murder in every sense. Paola Zani presented a stark contrast to Silvia in demeanour. In court, Paola broke down and apologised profusely. Overwhelmed by emotion, she made a statement. "I want to say sorry to everyone. To my mother whom I killed, to my uncles, to my sister, Lucia, to my grandma, to all the people of Tamu. I am sorry for everything. Most of all, I am so sorry for my mom." As she spoke these words, those present noted that her voice quavered and tears rolled down her face. It was an unexpected moment of genuine remorse amidst an otherwise cold procedural recounting of facts. Many in the courtroom, even hardened journalists, felt a pang of sorrow amid their revulsion. Here was a 20-year-old young woman who had done something unimaginably awful, now seemingly realizing the full weight of it. Her apology didn't change the outcome, but it offered a glimpse of humanity that had been missing from this story of monstrous deeds. It stood in contrast to Silvia's more rigid stance and to Mirto's silence. The testimony of the prison cellmate who had recorded Mirto was also pivotal. This witness recounted how Mirto had step-by-step narrated the murder while they were incarcerated together. The cellmate's diary and recollections confirmed the sequence of events. The muffin, Laura not falling unconscious as expected, Silvia's sudden attack, Paola joining in, and Mirto suffocating Laura with the bag. He even testified that Mirto still harboured a doubt that Laura might have been buried alive, which sent chills through the courtroom. This was essentially the same account that Mirto and the sisters had given in their confessions, but hearing it from an outside witness, a fellow inmate who was so disturbed that he aided investigators, likely made a strong impression on the judges and jurors. Throughout the trial, the prosecutors emphasized the extreme premeditation and almost theatrical coordination among the trio. Brescia's chief prosecutor, Francesca Cindy Bassani, argued that rarely had she seen such a calculated crime. From buying drugs, to preparing a burial site and alibi, to staging evidence, the trio had treated murder like a project to be meticulously managed. This undercut any narrative that they acted out of sudden fear or insanity. It's worth noting that the Italian justice process allows for 2 levels of appeals as of right. After the court d'assise's verdict, the trial court, the case can be appealed to the Court d'Assise d'Appello, appeals court, which can review not just legal technicalities, but also re-examine the evidence and even hear new evidence. Finally, there is the Court di Cassazione, Supreme Court of Cassation, that deals with legal procedure and interpretation issues. In this case, given the confessions and evidence, the trial was relatively straightforward, but the defense did appeal on various grounds, likely hoping for a sentence reduction or a reconsideration of the motive, hence the talk of psychiatric review. In December 2023, the Brescia Corte d'Assise delivered its verdict and sentence in the first instance trial. Guilty on all counts for Silvia Zani, Paola Zani, and Mirto Milani, and the punishment, the maximum allowed, life imprisonment for each of them. Italy's life sentence is indeterminate, with a possibility of parole review, typically after 21 to 30 years, but it signalled that the court viewed this crime as among the most grave and heinous. The judges also ordered the convicts to pay damages to the civil parties, for example, a sum to Lucia for the loss of her mother, though no amount can truly compensate such a loss. The written sentencing report, released some weeks later, echoed the sentiment that had emerged during trial, that the murder was committed to gratify the ego of the group and adequately celebrate their cohesion. The judges noted that there was no credible motive of necessity or understandable passion, not money, though greed was present, not hatred. They didn't truly hate Laura as a person, but a chillingly abstract motive of affirming their bond over this dark secret. The trio, the court wrote, acted with the willful participation of each one, without a shadow of a doubt, both in the planning and execution. The implication was clear. This was a thrill killing as much as an opportunistic one, an act of collective narcissism as much as a bid for inheritance. Following the conviction, the defense appealed, but in November 2024, the Brescia Appeals Court upheld the life sentences for all three defendants. The appellate judges, in a 72-page ruling, found that the evidence was overwhelming and agreed that each member of the trio was equally responsible. All three have been found guilty in the same way, and therefore all deserved the same punishment. The court explicitly rejected any attempt to portray one of them, for example, Paola as the youngest, or Silvia under Mirto's influence, as less culpable. They also brushed aside the alternate reality the sisters had tried to sell about Laura being a potential aggressor. There was simply no evidence for it, whereas there was abundant evidence of the trio's own deliberate malice. A poignant moment following the appeals verdict came when the lawyer representing Lucia, Laura's surviving daughter, spoke to the press. He expressed satisfaction that justice was being served, but noted, "It's just a shame that even today was another missed chance to hear an apology." By the time of the appeals decision, neither Silvia nor Mirto had shown genuine contrition in the courtroom. Paola's earlier apology, while heartfelt, stood alone. And in the appeal, apparently, no further apologies were offered. The convicts reportedly listened to the confirmation of their life sentences with heads lowered, then were escorted out to return to prison, where they will likely spend decades, if not their entire lives. The murder of Laura Ziliani and the conviction of her two daughters and a boyfriend for the crime is a case that Italy will not soon forget. In Italy, where family is sacred and mothers are often revered at the center of the household, the idea of daughters killing their own mother was virtually incomprehensible. Parricide, the killing of a parent by a child, is exceedingly rare, and when it does happen, it usually involves a history of abuse or severe mental illness. Here, the Zani sisters were not known to be abused. On the contrary, they had a relatively comfortable life. This made the crime all the more shocking and disturbing to the Italian public. The case also highlights some aspects of the Italian justice system. The lengthy pre-trial investigation, the use of wiretaps and an undercover cellmate operation, and the detailed written rationales by judges are hallmarks of the Italian approach. In a common law system like the United States or UK, once a suspect is arrested and indicted, the trial follows relatively quickly and is focused on what is presented in court, often within strict rules of evidence. In Italy, by contrast, the pre-trial phase gathered virtually all the evidence, physical, digital, testimonial, into a comprehensive dossier. By the time of trial, the judges and lawyers had vast amounts of information to work with. And because the defendants had confessed, the trial was not so much about guilt or innocence, that was established, but about understanding why it happened and ensuring the punishment fit the crime. One interesting difference is that in Italy, even after a conviction, the case isn't truly over until all appeals are exhausted. The Zani sisters and Mirto had their life sentences confirmed on first appeal, and presumably they might attempt a further appeal to the cassation, though that court can only overturn on procedural or legal error, not rejudge the facts. It's almost certain they will spend at least the next 20 to 30 years behind bars. Italian life sentences can sometimes be reduced for good behavior, or if the convicts cooperate, in mafia cases, informants can get reductions. But in a case like this, domestic, heinous, and with only belated cooperation, there's little chance of early release. The fact that they initially lied and only confessed when cornered likely means mercy will be in short supply. Barring any extraordinary turn of events, Silvia, Paola, and Mirto will be middle-aged or elderly if they ever walk free again. Meanwhile, what became of Laura's legacy? The family properties that allegedly motivated the crime were frozen during the investigation. Italian law has provisions, sometimes called unworthiness to succeed, that prevent those convicted of murdering someone from inheriting from their victim. Thus, Silvia and Paola cannot legally inherit Laura's estate. It's likely that Laura's assets will go to Lucia, the only surviving daughter who was not involved in the crime, or else to Laura's mother and siblings. Tragically, Lucia, who needs care, lost the person who cared for her most. In the aftermath, there were local efforts to support Lucia, including fundraisers for her living expenses. In one public appeal, family and friends of Laura expressed concern that Lucia didn't even have money for the funeral, and called for help to ensure she would be taken care of. This galvanizing of community support for the innocent victim stands in stark contrast to the cold self-interest displayed by the perpetrators. For the people of Temu, the beautiful village now carries a scar from this event. A place known for ski slopes and hiking trails is now also known for an almost literary crime, the mystery of Temu, as it's been called there. In closing, one can't help but return to the image of Laura, a dedicated mother, a former policewoman who spent her life serving the public, setting out happily on a trail one morning, possibly smiling at the thought of the muffins her daughters baked for her, never imagining that those she loved most were about to end her life. It is a heartbreaking image, and one that lingers. The courtroom verdict may have delivered justice on paper, but it can never bring back Laura or fully mend the hearts of those who loved her. The Laura Ziliani case will be remembered for its almost unthinkable betrayal and the dogged pursuit of truth by investigators. It stands as a testament that evil can sometimes wear the face of a loved one, and that justice, while served, cannot always explain the unfathomable. In the words of an Italian proverb, translated as, "The devil makes the pots, but not the lids," meaning evil deeds will eventually come to light. In the silent valleys of Temu, the truth of Laura's fate did come to light, and with it, a shocking tale that will not be easily forgotten. Thank you so much for listening. We really do appreciate it. If you enjoy underreported global murder cases like this one, please consider following or subscribing. We'll be releasing 2 new episodes every week, and we're just getting started.